Joining us now, my old political adversary during the so-called cable talk wars of the 1990s and beyond, Lanny Davis, political consultant for the eponymously named Lanny J. Davis and Associates, also former special counsel to President Clinton. Lanny, it's good to have you here this morning on America's Forum.
Well, thank you. When we think about our past days, I really think of it as respectful sparring, and if you were an adversary, you were a formidable intellectual adversary. That's all. It was never personal because you're actually quite
Of course
funny.
not. We had the battle joined, and we had some interesting discussions, but we have an issue now
Right.
that really, rather than debating you, I just want to ask you some questions. And first of all, what led you to write the article appearing now at thehill.com?
Well, as I started the article, I reacted as a human being to seeing a Palestinian little girl paralyzed from the neck down because of an Israeli bomb, and I got sick. As I write, I had to turn away and almost tearful. But then I watched the report not tell the rest of the story, which, as much as my heart went out to this poor little girl and to all the civilian casualties on both sides, mostly on the Palestinian side, it's absolutely fundamental to journalism that you don't tell one fact and then ignore another fact. And the second fact missing on, I have to say, mostly CNN, MSNBC, only really Fox seems to stress the second fact, which is that Israel is acting in self-defense and doing everything it can beyond what any army that I know of in history has ever done to warn Hamas and the civilians where the rockets are embedded in homes, hospitals, and using children and women as shields, which is a defined war crime that Israel warns before it directs its bombs and tells people to leave, including the Hamas fighters and their missiles, which is to the disadvantage of Israeli civilians who are going to be killed by those missiles. That fact, it's indisputable that Hamas is using these civilian sites as human shields, women and children, schools, hospitals, as shields where they put their missiles. That's a defined war crime. That's a fact. And the number of journalists who show these terrible scenes in Gaza, who then say, however, and add the indisputable fact that I've just described, are few and far between.
Lanny, you made mention of CNN, and in fact, Israeli Ambassador Ron Dermer took exception to CNN's handling and reporting on the crisis. Take a listen to this exchange from the cable news network, and we'll get your thoughts after we listen to it.
Do you not think that it's relevant to report on CNN that the Secretary General of the United Nations yesterday warned against the use of UN schools and shelter for rocket missile depots of Hamas?
And Ambassador, it is relevant. And let me ask you this, because of what you said.
But Aaron, I've been listening for 2 hours of reports on CNN. I have seen split screens, horrible pictures that any decent human being would be horrified by. I have not heard a single person say what I just said to you now. And I think that that does a disservice to your viewers.
Now, the Israeli ambassador continued his attack on CNN's bias with a suggestion that the network was not properly doing its homework on the conflict. Lanny, as we made mention of before, you're no stranger to these cable news newsrooms. What is your take on what is transpiring at CNN and other mainstream media outlets?
Well, 2 points I'd like to take issue with. I don't think we disagree, but I think to be complete in the way you asked the question. First, it's not just CNN. It's all the cable news networks. I think Fox has been more balanced than MSNBC and CNN. Also, the network broadcast. I watch Brian Williams, an old friend of mine. Again, CBS and ABC focus on the terrible, terrible tragedy that I started out by noting made me sick of children and civilians in Gaza being killed, but then didn't add the fact, which I believe is mandatory, not discretionary. It's mandatory that you say, however, no matter what you show on the West Bank, on the Gaza civilian story, you must without any exception, add, however, it is a fact that Hamas uses these children that you've just seen killed and maimed by Israeli bombs as human shields, which is defined as a war crime. And I saw Brian Williams with a correspondent from NBC doing a similar story of this terrible tragedy going on, and didn't ask the correspondent, well, isn't it true that these children that we just saw are intentionally used by Hamas as shields where they place their missiles in schools, hospitals, and in their homes, where the home is one part an arsenal of missiles and the second part of the home is supposedly where people live. And then also add that Israel warns by dropping leaflets, sending text messages, placing phone calls, we're about to bomb, you get out. And no other army I know of in world history has ever done that.
Lanny, obviously you are a proud Democrat, and we alluded to our friendly discussions in the past on various cable networks. But taking a look at what is transpiring, policy is predicated on politics, which in turn is predicated on perceptions. As you take a look at the Obama administration and its approach in terms of foreign policy, how much of the indulgence of the viewpoint of Hamas may be an outgrowth of this administration's less than energetic embrace of Israel, as it appears to so many?
Well, I don't have any doubt that President Obama and Secretary Kerry are extremely pro-Israel and support Israel. My concerns and my respectful disagreements right now, and I emphasize right now, is they're making false equivalence statements. For example, the president has asked for, quote, an unconditional truce. Unconditional, humane truce means that Hamas cannot use the truce to import arms and more missiles. It means food and medical supplies and other humane materials, which Israel has said yes to every time, and Hamas has said no to. So when the President of the United States says, I call for an unconditional ceasefire, which I support, if the words unconditional means but limited to humane materials, food and medical supplies, etc., and prohibiting any military supplies, he must add that sentence after the words unconditional, as well as Secretary Kerry going to Europe and going any other place other than being in the Middle East and working with Egypt, which is the best broker of a ceasefire, and Secretary Clinton in November 2012 in a very similar situation, before an intervention was necessary, before the rockets got out of control, 1,000 or 1,500 a day. She supported the president of Egypt, who in those days was Morsi, the head of the Brotherhood, and she and Morsi were able to get a ceasefire. So I don't know what Secretary Kerry thinks he's getting out of Europeans when he ought to be in the Middle East working with Egypt.
Well, you mentioned Secretary Kerry, and Lanny, over the weekend, a lot of columnists and opinion leaders in Israel spoke rather disapprovingly. We've got about a minute and a half left, but I believe a columnist in the Jerusalem Post went so far as to talk about Secretary Kerry's, quote, betrayal of Israel by inserting himself into the discussions and trying to come up with a new template for a truce. Has the Secretary's work been counterproductive?
You know, I don't use words that have personal attack connotations or impugning people's motives. You know that about me, JD. So the word betrayal is way, way over the top. Secretary Kerry, I respect greatly, known him since college, wants peace in the Middle East and is very pro-Israel. But his judgment is flawed. And therefore, I would say his judgment in not supporting Egypt and not insisting that a ceasefire be without any import of armaments or missiles, and then Israel would accept, as I think the world would want, this bloodshed to stop. I think his judgment is flawed, but he's tried very hard, and I would not impute his motives at all.
All right, Lanny Davis, we appreciate it. Again, your article entitled Journalist Must Report on Israeli Self-Restraint. It can be found at thehill.com. Lanny Davis, many thanks for your time here on America's Forum.
Thanks so much, JD.
So your take on what is transpiring in terms of press coverage, why don't you tweet us your comments at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum. We'll have a Newsmax Now update coming up.